My name is Henrietta. I'm 60 years old, and what I'm about to tell you today will forever change the way you see your own family. Just 3 days ago, my own son Dennis and my daughter-in-law Sharon pushed my husband Walter and me off a 90-foot cliff. As I lay there broken and bleeding, I heard my husband's desperate whisper, "Henrietta, don't move. Play dead." But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was when Walter revealed the most terrible truth a mother could ever hear. A secret our children had kept for 25 years. For 4 decades, Walter and I built what we thought was the perfect family. We woke up every morning in our little suburban home, where the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sound of birds singing. I worked as a teacher at the local elementary school, and every afternoon I came home with stories of my young students. Walter had his carpentry shop, where he created the most beautiful furniture you've ever seen. His hands, rough yet delicate, could transform a simple piece of wood into a work of art. We had 2 sons, Ralph, our firstborn, and Dennis, 5 years younger. Ralph was the soul of the house, always laughing, always helping his father in the shop, always shielding me from any worries. Dennis was different, more reserved, but I loved him with the same intensity. As a mother, you never play favorites, or at least that's what I thought. On Sundays after church, the whole family would gather around our oak table, which Walter had carved with his own hands. Ralph would tell us his plans to study engineering, while Dennis would remain silent, just picking at the food on his plate. Life was simple but beautiful. In the evenings, Walter and I would walk the trail around our small town, talking about our dreams, how we'd watch our grandchildren grow, and how we'd grow old together in that very house. I never imagined those walks were training for the one that almost killed me. On weekends, I'd host family gatherings where my sisters Bernice and Myrtle would come with their husbands and children. The house would fill with laughter, kids running everywhere, women sharing recipes in the kitchen while the men fixed something in the yard. Walter was my perfect partner. After 40 years of marriage, he still brought me wildflowers he'd picked on the way to work. He helped me grade my students' tests, and I would hold pieces of wood for him while he cut them in his workshop. We were a team, an unbreakable unit, or so I thought. At night, we'd sit on the porch to watch the stars, planning our future. We talked about traveling when we retired, seeing the ocean for the first time, building a smaller house once our kids started their own families. But perfect happiness, as I would discover years later, often hides the deepest tragedies. When Ralph turned 20, something changed in our family. He began to argue with Dennis about things I didn't understand. I'd hear them whispering in the hallway, and they'd fall silent when I appeared. Walter told me it was just brotherly stuff, that it would pass. I wanted to believe him because I needed to believe my family was still perfect. One night in October, exactly 25 years ago, Ralph didn't come home for dinner. We waited until 11, then 12, then 1 in the morning. Dennis was in his room supposedly studying, but I noticed something strange in his eyes whenever I asked about his brother. Walter went out to search for him with our neighbors. They checked every corner of town, every trail, every place Ralph used to go. At dawn, they found his body at the bottom of the river gorge. The police said it was an accident, that he had probably stumbled in the dark. I never questioned that version, because I couldn't imagine that the truth was much more horrible. Ralph's funeral was the darkest day of my life. I wore my only black dress, the same one I'd worn at my mother's funeral. Dennis was strangely calm for someone who had just lost his older brother. While I cried until I had no tears left, he remained silent, with an expression that now, after what I know, sends shivers down my spine. Walter never left my side all day, holding me up when my legs gave out, whispering words of comfort that I now know tasted bitter in his mouth. After Ralph's death, Dennis changed completely. He became more attentive, more loving, as if he were trying to make up for something. He helped me with chores, accompanied his father to the workshop, and brought me little gifts when he saw I was sad. I thought it was his way of dealing with grief, of filling the void Ralph had left behind. How naive I was. What he was really doing was building a perfect mask to hide the monster inside. The years passed and the wound never fully healed, but we learned to live with it. Dennis married Sharon, a sweet girl from the next town over, and they seemed happy. They had 2 beautiful children, and I finally felt like life was giving us a second chance at happiness. Sharon called me Mom and helped me with the housework when they visited. Dennis had inherited his father's talent for carpentry, and had his own business. Everything seemed perfect again. But now, lying at the bottom of this gorge with my ribs broken and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, I understand that all that happiness was a carefully constructed lie. The first signs that something was wrong began 6 months ago, when Walter and I decided to update our will. We had saved our entire lives, and between the house, the land I inherited from my parents, and our bank savings, we had nearly $200,000 to leave our children and grandchildren. It was Dennis who suggested we visit the lawyer. "Mom, Dad, you're both 60 years old now. It's important to have everything in order," he told us with that smile that now seemed sinister. Sharon nodded beside him, stroking my hand with those fingers that would later push me to my death. "We love you so much, and we want to make sure you're protected," she added in her sweet voice. How foolish I was to interpret those words as genuine love. The lawyer, an older man named Lawrence, whom we had known for years, explained the options. We could put everything in a trust, divide the inheritance among Dennis's children, or simply make a traditional will. Dennis insisted on naming him and Sharon as our sole heirs, arguing that they would handle the equitable distribution to the grandchildren. "Besides," he said, "you're going to need us when you're older. It's better for us to have access to the resources to take care of you properly." Something in his tone made me uncomfortable, but Walter seemed convinced. My husband, who had always been more trusting than me, accepted the proposal without much resistance. I had my doubts, especially since I remembered how Ralph had always talked about helping us financially when we got older. My oldest son had plans, dreams of taking care of us when the time came. But Ralph was gone, and Dennis was our only surviving child. We signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember Sharon was wearing a pretty green dress and gave me a big hug after the ceremony. "Now we're officially a united family forever," she whispered in my ear. Her words gave me a chill then, though I didn't understand why. Dennis shook his father's hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That night, as I made dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. The following weeks were strange. Dennis and Sharon started visiting us more often, but their visits had a different feel. They no longer came just to spend time with family. They always had suggestions about how we should improve the house, what investments we should make, or what life insurance policies we should get. "Mom, you should think about selling this big house and moving somewhere smaller," Sharon said while examining our furniture with calculating eyes. "We could help you find a comfortable apartment in town." But I loved our house. Every corner held a memory. Every room told a story of our 40 years of marriage. The kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals for my family. The workshop where Walter created his masterpieces. The yard where our children and grandchildren had played. I couldn't imagine my life anywhere else. When I told them this, I saw a flicker of irritation in Dennis's eyes that chilled me to the bone. "Mom, you're being irrational," he said in a tone he had never used with me before. "This house is too big for 2 people your age. If you fall down the stairs or something happens, we won't be able to help you in time." Sharon nodded vigorously, adding, "Besides, the upkeep must cost a fortune. It would be much smarter to sell now while the housing market is high and move to something more appropriate for your age." Walter began to consider their arguments. My husband, who had always been practical, started talking about the logic behind their suggestions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind all this pressure. One night, after another of these tense conversations, I asked Walter if he didn't think it was strange that Dennis was suddenly so interested in our financial affairs. "Henrietta, he just cares about us," he replied while brushing his teeth. "Maybe we should consider his suggestions. We're not as young as we used to be." But I saw something in my husband's eyes, a shadow of doubt he didn't want to acknowledge. Now I know that Walter already had his suspicions, that he had started to connect the dots I didn't even know existed. Things escalated when Dennis suggested we give him power of attorney over our finances. "It's just for precaution," he explained while Sharon prepared tea in our kitchen as if she owned the place. "If one of you gets sick or has a health issue, we can manage your affairs without legal complications." The way he said it, so naturally, so logically, almost convinced me. But there was something about his insistence that made me nervous. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Walter's breathing beside me, trying to understand why I felt so uneasy. The next day, I decided to call my sister Bernice for advice. Bernice had always been sharper than me, more suspicious of people's intentions. When I told her about Dennis's pressure, she was silent for a long moment. Henrietta, she finally said, doesn't it seem strange to you that Dennis is so anxious to control your money? I mean, he has his own business. He's doing well financially. Why would he need so much control over your finances? Her words hit me like a slap. She was right. Dennis had never seemed to have financial problems, had never borrowed money, had never shown any signs of needing our financial help. That afternoon, when Dennis came for another of his talks about our future, I decided to confront him directly. Son, I said as we sat in the living room, why is it so important for you to have control over our financial affairs? Your father and I are still in our right minds. His reaction was immediate and telling. His face hardened, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of someone else. Something cold, calculating, and dangerous. Mom, it's not about control, he responded in a tense voice. It's about love, care, and family responsibility. But the way he said family responsibility sounded more like a threat than an expression of affection. Sharon, who had been silent until then, intervened with her sweet but firm voice. Henrietta, we just want what's best for you. It's painful to see you worry about things we could easily handle. That night, after they left, Walter and I had our first serious argument in years. He thought I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems where there were none. I insisted something wasn't right, that our son's behavior had changed too much. Walter, I said as we washed the dishes, do you remember what Dennis was like before Ralph died? He was different, more distant. I don't know how to explain it, but there was something about him that scared me. My husband stopped washing the plate in his hands and looked at me intently. In his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen before, recognition. Henrietta, he said in a very low voice, there are things about Ralph's death that I never told you. My heart began to pound so hard I thought it would beat out of my chest. Walter's words hit me like a lightning bolt. What about Ralph's death? I asked with a trembling voice. My husband sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, the same table where we had shared thousands of family meals, where Ralph used to do his homework, and where Dennis had always remained silent. Walter ran his hands over his face, as if he were trying to erase the memories that had tormented him for 25 years. The night Ralph died, he began in a broken voice, Dennis wasn't in his room studying like he told us. I saw him leave the house around 8. I followed him because something about his attitude worried me. He'd been very strange those days, more aggressive, more resentful. My husband paused, looking at his hands as if the terrible truth he had kept for so long was written on them. I saw them arguing by the gorge, Henrietta. I heard them screaming horrible things at each other. My world began to spin. What were they arguing about? I whispered, even though part of me no longer wanted to know the answer. Walter looked up and I saw tears in his eyes, tears he hadn't even shed at our oldest son's funeral. About the inheritance, Henrietta. Dennis was furious because Ralph was the oldest because according to family tradition, he would inherit most of our assets. But there was something more, something about money that Ralph had found. What money? I asked, feeling the ground vanish beneath my feet. Walter sighed deeply before continuing. 3 days before he died, Ralph came to talk to me in the workshop. He had discovered that Dennis had been stealing money from the family savings account. Small amounts at first, but then larger sums. Ralph had proof. He'd been investigating for months. My mind refused to process what I was hearing. My youngest son, the one who had been so attentive after Ralph's death, the one who helped and cared for us, had been stealing from us since before his brother died. Why didn't you ever tell me? I accused Walter, feeling the betrayal multiply twofold. Because when I got to the gorge that night, it was already too late, he replied in a choked voice. I saw Dennis standing next to Ralph's body. Our youngest son was trembling, crying, and repeating over and over, "It was an accident. It was an accident." He looked at me with those desperate eyes and begged me to help him. "Dad," he said, "Ralph tripped when he was trying to hit me. I just defended myself and he lost his balance." Tears ran down my cheeks uncontrollably. "But you believed him," I murmured, even though I already knew the answer. Walter nodded slowly with an expression of guilt that had gnawed at him for decades. He was my son, Henrietta. My youngest son was asking for my help, and Ralph was already dead. I couldn't bring one back to life by destroying the other. I thought it was really an accident, that Dennis had learned his lesson, that he would become a better man after this. And the stolen money? I asked, needing to know every detail of this nightmare. Dennis promised he would pay it back little by little, that he had taken the money to invest in a business that had gone wrong. He swore he would never do something like that again. And I believed him, Henrietta. God forgive me, but I believed him because I needed to believe my son wasn't a killer. I got up from the table, stumbling, holding on to the wall so I wouldn't fall. Everything I had believed about my family, about my surviving son, about the last 25 years of my life was a lie. Did he pay the money back? I asked, although I already knew the answer from the look on Walter's face. Never, he replied. In fact, he kept stealing small amounts that I pretended not to notice, because confronting him would mean admitting I had covered up a murder. I became his accomplice, Henrietta. Every time I stayed silent, every time I pretended not to see the bank accounts dwindle, I became more of his accomplice. The horrible reality began to take shape in my mind. That's why he's so interested in controlling our finances now, I murmured. It's not because he cares about us. It's because he wants to finish what he started 25 years ago. Walter nodded gravely. And there's something else, Henrietta. Something I just discovered a few weeks ago. What else could there be? I asked, feeling like my heart couldn't take any more revelations. Walter went to his desk and pulled out some papers he had been hiding under other documents. I've been discreetly investigating Dennis's finances. His carpentry business isn't doing as well as he wants us to believe. In fact, he's on the verge of bankruptcy. He owes more than $100,000 to several banks and suppliers. The papers trembled in my hands as I read the numbers. Dennis wasn't the successful man he pretended to be. He was a desperate failure who had been living on lies and stolen money for decades. Does Sharon know all this? I asked, remembering her sweet smile and loving hugs. I'm sure she does, Walter replied. I've noticed how she directs the conversations when they talk about our money. How she asks specific questions about our savings, the value of the house, our life insurance policies. They aren't innocent questions, Henrietta. They are questions from someone calculating exactly how much our death is worth. That sentence chilled me to the bone. Our death, I repeated in a whisper. It was the first time I had considered that Dennis might want to cause us physical harm. Until that moment, I thought he just wanted to rob or cheat us. But if he had killed his own brother for money, what would stop him from killing his parents for the same reason? Walter, I said, grabbing his hands, we have to go to the police. We have to tell them the truth about Ralph and about what's happening now. But my husband shook his head with a look of hopelessness that broke my heart. With what evidence, Henrietta? I'm an accomplice to covering up a murder. If I talk now, I'll go to jail too. And besides, who's going to believe an old man of 65 who's been keeping this secret for 25 years? He was right. So what do we do? Just wait for him to kill us like he killed Ralph. We're going to be very careful, Walter said, trying to sound more confident than he really was. We're going to find a way to protect ourselves, to gather evidence to... But his words were interrupted by the sound of the phone. It was Dennis. Hi, Mom, he said with that sweet voice that now sounded sinister to me. Sharon and I were thinking, and we believe it would be beautiful to celebrate your 40th wedding anniversary with something special. How about we take you to those mountains you've always talked about next weekend? We could go on a family hike, take pictures, and have a perfect day together. My blood turned to ice. I looked at Walter, who had heard the conversation and had the same look of terror on his face. That's a very sweet idea, son, I managed to reply in a trembling voice. But let us think about it, and we'll get back to you tomorrow. After hanging up, Walter and I looked at each other in silence, knowing we had just received an invitation to our own execution. The mountains, I murmured. He's going to take us to the mountains to kill us and make it look like an accident. Walter nodded gravely, just like he did with Ralph at the gorge. That night we didn't sleep a minute, holding each other in our bed, planning how we could save ourselves from our own son. The next few days were a nightmare of terror and pretense. Walter and I had to act as if nothing had happened when Dennis and Sharon came to visit, smiling when they talked about the mountain trip, nodding when they excitedly told us they were going to spend time with family. But inside, every fiber of my being screamed with fear. I knew I was looking into the eyes of my oldest son's murderers, and that now they were planning to do the same to me and my husband. Sharon arrived on Wednesday afternoon with a shopping bag, and that radiant smile that now seemed like the grimace of a demon. "Henrietta dear," she said, hugging me with those arms that would soon push me to my death. "I bought some supplies for our mountain adventure: cookies, water, fruit, everything we'll need for the picnic." She showed me the contents of the bag as if she were an excited child, but I could only think about how each of those items could be used to cover up our murder. "I also brought my new camera," she added, pulling out an expensive digital camera. "I want to capture every moment of this special day. They're going to be photos we'll treasure forever." The irony of her words made me sick. The only photo she would take would be of our broken bodies at the bottom of some cliff, if anyone ever found us. Dennis appeared behind her carrying a new-looking hiking backpack. "Dad," he said to Walter with feigned enthusiasm, "I bought all the necessary equipment for a safe hike: ropes, harnesses, lanterns, a first aid kit." Every word that came out of his mouth sounded like a cruel mockery. Safety equipment to plan our murders. The perversity of the situation made me dizzy. "Isn't it a bit dangerous for people our age?" I asked, trying to sound casual while looking for any excuse to cancel the trip. Sharon stroked my cheek with that false tenderness that churned my stomach. "That's why we chose a very easy and safe trail," she assured me. "It's a hike even kids can do. Plus, Dennis and I will be there to take care of you the whole time." Yes, they would be there to take care of us, until the exact moment they decided to push us off a cliff. That night, when they finally left, Walter and I sat in our living room, trembling not just from the cold, but from the absolute terror we had been holding back for hours. "We can't go," I said, grabbing his hands. "We just can't. We'll make up some excuse." "If we don't go," Walter replied in a grave voice, "they'll find another way to kill us. Maybe something that looks even more accidental, like a house fire or a robbery gone wrong. At least in the mountains, we know what they're going to try to do." His words had a terrible logic, but they didn't comfort me at all. "So what do you suggest?" I asked, desperate to find some solution that would save our lives. Walter was thoughtful for a few minutes before answering. "We're going to go, but we're going to be prepared. I'm going to hide my cell phone and set it to record everything that happens. If we manage to survive, we'll have evidence. And if we don't," his voice broke, "at least someone will know the truth." On Friday night, we could barely touch our dinner. We knew it might be our last meal together in our house, in that kitchen where we had shared so many happy moments when we were a real family. Walter reviewed his will one more time, making sure that if something happened to us, at least Dennis wouldn't get everything without there being some record of our suspicions. "I wrote a letter," he confessed, pulling a sealed envelope from his desk. "It's addressed to your sister Bernice. In it, I explain everything we know about Ralph's death, and what we believe Dennis plans to do to us. I hid it in the place where we keep our important documents. If we don't return from this trip, at least she'll know where to look for the truth." That night, we went to bed holding each other, whispering words of love that could be our last. "If something happens to me," Walter said, "I want you to know that these 40 years with you have been the best of my life. Despite everything, despite the mistakes and the secrets, I love you more than my own life." I cried in silence, memorizing the rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body, the smell of his skin. Saturday dawned with a clear sky that seemed to mock our situation. Dennis arrived early, whistling a cheerful tune that chilled my blood. "Morning, lovebirds," he called from the front door. "Ready for your big adventure?" Sharon appeared behind him, radiant as a bride on her wedding day, except this was a wedding with death. During breakfast, which we could barely eat, Dennis explained the route we would take in detail. "It's a beautiful trail," he said, spreading a map on the table. "It leads to a lookout where you can see the whole valley. They say the views are spectacular." His eyes shone with an enthusiasm that seemed demonic. Of course the views would be spectacular. They would be the last we would see in our lives. "The trail has some steep parts," Sharon added as if giving us useful tourist information, "but nothing that experienced hikers like you can't handle." Her comment about our supposed hiking abilities sounded like a cruel joke. We were two 60-year-olds who barely walked through the park once in a while. As we loaded the car, I saw Dennis meticulously checking his backpack, making sure he had everything he needed for his plan. I saw ropes, a small shovel, and something that looked like a flare gun. "What's that for?" I asked, pointing to the gun. "For safety," he replied without missing a beat. "If we get lost or something goes wrong, we can send a distress signal." Of course, they would send a distress signal after pushing us off a cliff so our bodies could be found, and it would be confirmed that it was a tragic accident during a family hike. Everything was calculated. Every detail had been planned to make our murders look perfectly natural. The car ride to the mountains lasted 2 hours that felt like an eternity. Sharon put on cheerful music and sang along with the songs as if we were really going on a fun family outing. Dennis drove carefully, obeying all the speed limits, stopping at every stop sign. He didn't want to risk an accident that would ruin his perfect plans. During the trip, Walter discreetly took my hand and activated the recording on his phone. Everything that happened from that moment on would be recorded. If we managed to survive, we would have proof. If not, at least the truth wouldn't die with us. When we finally arrived at the trailhead, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would beat out of my chest. The place was beautiful, with tall trees and the sound of a nearby river. But for me, it had become the setting for my own execution. Dennis and Sharon took their backpacks out of the car, smiling and joking as if it were the happiest day of their lives. "Ready for the adventure?" Dennis asked. And for the first time in 25 years, I saw the same cold glint in his eyes that he'd had the night he killed his brother. The trail started out relatively easy, winding between lush trees and moss-covered rocks. Sharon walked ahead of us, constantly taking pictures and commenting on the beauty of the landscape. "Look at those wildflowers," she exclaimed, pointing toward bushes full of yellow blossoms, "and that beautiful bird." Her performance was perfect, that of a loving daughter-in-law enjoying a special day with her in-laws. Dennis walked behind us, supposedly to make sure we didn't fall behind. But I could feel his eyes on our backs like daggers. Every time I turned to look at him, he smiled with that grin he had perfected over 25 years of lies. "How are you doing, Mom and Dad?" he would ask with fake concern. "Need to stop and rest?" After an hour of hiking, we began to climb a steeper part of the trail. My legs already felt heavy, and Walter was breathing with difficulty. We weren't used to this kind of exercise, and our murderous children knew it perfectly. They had chosen a route that would physically exhaust us, making us vulnerable for when the time came to execute their plan. "We're almost at the lookout," Sharon announced, although according to the map I had seen at home, we still had at least another hour of hiking. Her lie confirmed that they had no intention of reaching the real lookout. The place where they planned to kill us must be much closer. During the hike, I tried to memorize every detail of the trail. Every tree, every rock that could serve as a reference if I managed to survive and needed to explain to the police exactly where everything had happened. Walter was doing the same, and we occasionally exchanged glances loaded with terror and determination. We knew we were walking toward our deaths, but we also knew it was our only chance to get evidence against our murderers. "Oh, look at that!" Sharon suddenly shouted, pointing to a rock formation that loomed to our right. "That cliff has an incredible view. Why don't we climb up there to take some special photos?" My blood ran cold. There it was, the place they had chosen for our murder. The cliff rose about 90 feet above the main trail, accessible by a secondary path that seemed much more dangerous than the one we had been following. The rocks were loose, there were fewer trees to grab onto in case we stumbled, and from the top, you could see a precipice that fell into a deep gorge full of jagged rocks. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said, trying to sound casual. "That trail looks pretty dangerous for people our age." But Dennis had already started walking toward the turnoff, carrying his backpack full of safety equipment that I knew he wouldn't use to save us. "Come on, Mom," he said with that voice he used when he was a kid and wanted to convince me of something. "It'll only take a few minutes. Besides, Sharon's right. The photos from up there are going to be spectacular." The way he said spectacular made me tremble. They would be spectacular for whoever saw them afterward as evidence of our accident. Walter squeezed my hand discreetly, reminding me that his phone was recording everything. We had to go on. We had to go all the way to get the evidence we needed. If we refused now, they would simply find another opportunity, another place, another excuse to kill us. The climb to the cliff was exhausting. The loose rocks slid under our feet, and more than once I was about to fall. But the most terrifying thing was realizing how perfect this place was for a murder. If someone accidentally tripped and fell from the top, there would be no way to survive, and most importantly, there would be no witnesses. "Almost there," Sharon shouted from above, where she had already arrived with the agility of someone who had planned this route carefully. Dennis followed her and then helped Walter and me complete the last few feet of the climb. His hands on my arms felt like the claws of a vulture. The lookout was indeed spectacular. From there you could see the whole valley, the mountains in the distance, and the river winding through the trees. In any other circumstance it would have been a beautiful moment to share with family. But knowing what I knew, the place seemed like the perfect setting for a nightmare. "Come over here for the photos," Sharon shouted, positioning herself near the edge of the cliff. "I want the valley to be in the background." Walter and I approached slowly, each step bringing us closer to our final destination. I could see Dennis strategically positioning himself behind us, calculating angles, measuring distances. "Perfect," Sharon exclaimed, raising her camera. "Now hug each other and smile." Walter and I hugged, probably for the last time, while she took picture after picture. Every click of the camera seemed like a metronome counting down to our deaths. "Take one more," Dennis suggested, moving closer to us. "But this time stand back a little so the landscape looks better." One step back meant being exactly on the edge of the precipice. Walter and I exchanged a look. The time had come. We moved back as we were told, feeling the solid ground disappear under our feet, and only the emptiness of the abyss remaining behind us. Sharon raised the camera one more time, but this time I saw something different in her eyes. There was no longer any need to pretend. The mask had fallen. "Smile," she said in a voice that was no longer sweet at all. "This is going to be your last photo." At that moment, Dennis lunged toward us with his arms outstretched. The plan was simple. Push us backward so we would fall into the void, take some photos of the accident, and then go down to discover our broken bodies. But Walter had been preparing for this moment. In the last second, he managed to grab Dennis's wrist and pull him forward. "If we're going to die, you're coming with us," he shouted with a fury I had never seen in him before. For a moment, all four of us were teetering on the edge of the cliff, holding on to each other in a macabre dance between life and death. Sharon screamed and tried to help Dennis, but the weight of all of us was too much. I felt the ground give way under my feet, felt gravity begin to win the battle. And then the four of us fell together, locked in a deadly embrace, screaming as the air whistled around us and the rocky ground approached at breakneck speed. In those seconds that lasted an eternity, I thought of Ralph, of how he must have felt when Dennis pushed him into the gorge 25 years ago. The impact was brutal. I heard the horrible sound of bones cracking, the sound of my own body shattering against the rocks. The pain was indescribable, but even more terrible was the taste of blood in my mouth, and the certainty that this time Dennis had won. This time there would be no witnesses to tell the truth. But then I heard Walter's voice, weak but clear. "Henrietta, don't move. Play dead." And I realized something incredible. I was still alive. The pain was so intense I thought I would go crazy. Every fiber of my body screamed in agony. I felt blood running down my face and something wet and sticky soaking my clothes. But Walter's voice echoed in my ears like a divine command. "Play dead." With a willpower I didn't know I possessed, I remained completely still, controlling even my breathing so it would be imperceptible. A few feet away, I could hear the moans of pain from Dennis and Sharon. They had also survived the fall, but from their groans, they seemed to be in worse condition than we were. "Sharon," I heard my son's broken voice. "Are you okay?" His concern for his wife made my stomach churn. This man who had murdered his own brother, and had tried to kill us, was still capable of feeling love for someone. "I think I broke my leg," Sharon moaned. "It hurts so much, Dennis." "And what about the old people?" The disrespectful way she referred to us confirmed what I already knew. We had never been family to her. We were just obstacles on her way to our money. I heard movement as if Dennis were crawling toward us. My heart was beating so fast I was afraid he would hear it. "They're dead," he announced after a few minutes that felt like hours. "Both of them have their eyes open, but they're not breathing." His lie filled me with a strange hope. If he believed we were dead, maybe we would have a chance. "Perfect," Sharon whispered with a satisfaction that chilled my blood. It worked just like we planned. Well, except for the part where we fell too. I heard her bitter laugh. At least we won't have to pretend we love them anymore. For the next few minutes that felt like an eternity, Dennis and Sharon discussed their situation. Both were injured, but they could move. The plan now was to crawl until they found a place from which they could call for help, and then tell the story of how they had miraculously survived a tragic accident that had killed their poor parents. "Remember the story?" Dennis said to Sharon. "We were taking pictures when a rock came loose under Dad's feet. He tripped and trying to grab on, he pulled Mom with him. We tried to help, but we fell too. It's important that our stories match." "I know," Sharon replied. "We've practiced this 100 times. We're the traumatized survivors of a family tragedy. Poor us. We lost our dear in-laws in a horrible accident." Her performance was so convincing that if I hadn't lived the truth, I would have believed every word. Gradually, their voices faded as they crawled toward what they hoped would be their salvation. When silence finally fell, Walter whispered my name so low I could barely hear it. "Henrietta, are you okay?" I answered in the same whisper, confirming that I was alive but terribly injured. "My left leg is broken," he told me in a voice choked with pain. "And I think I have a few fractured ribs. What about you?" I did a mental inventory of my body. I felt a stabbing pain in my right arm. My head throbbed as if someone were hitting it with a hammer, and there was definitely something wrong with my shoulder. But I was alive, and that was more than I had hoped for. "We're bad, but we're alive," I whispered. "It works, but there's no signal down here." That was the most terrifying part of our situation. We were alive but trapped at the bottom of a gorge, injured, and with no way to communicate with the outside world. If no one came to look for us, we would die here slowly from thirst, hunger, or our wounds. "Walter," I whispered, "before it's too late, I need you to tell me everything. Everything that really happened the night Ralph died." My husband sighed deeply as if he had been waiting for this moment for 25 years. "That night," he began in a trembling voice, "Ralph came to find me in the workshop. He was furious. He had papers in his hands, bank statements. He showed me evidence that Dennis had been stealing money from our accounts for months. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. Ralph had been investigating because he had noticed discrepancies in our savings." The physical pain mingled with the emotional pain as I listened to the truth that had been hidden for decades. "Ralph wanted to confront Dennis that same night," Walter continued. "I tried to calm him down, to convince him to wait until the next day, but he was determined. He said he couldn't sleep knowing his younger brother was stealing from us." "And you followed him?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "I followed him because I was afraid of what might happen. I knew Ralph's temper when he got angry, and I also knew. Well, I had noticed something strange about Dennis lately. A coldness that sent shivers down my spine. When I got to the gorge," Walter continued, "I found them screaming at each other. Ralph had the papers in his hand, waving them in Dennis's face. 'You're a thief,' he was yelling. 'You're stealing from our own parents.' Dennis denied everything. He said Ralph was crazy, that he was making things up. My heart raced as I imagined the scene. My two sons facing off in the dark, one accusing the other of betrayal. What happened next?" I asked. Walter paused for a long time before continuing. "Ralph told him that if he didn't return the money and confess everything to us, he would tell us the truth himself. Dennis went berserk. He yelled that Ralph had always been the favorite, that he had always had everything easy, that it was time for things to change. And then Walter's voice broke. Dennis pushed Ralph. It wasn't an accident. He pushed him with all his strength deliberately. I saw Ralph trying to keep his balance, saw his arms flailing desperately, looking for something to grab onto. But it was too late. Tears streamed down my cheeks, mixing with the blood from my wounds. "Why did you never tell me the truth?" Walter sighed deeply. "Because when I got to where Dennis was, he was crying, trembling, telling me over and over that it had been an accident, that he hadn't meant to do it. He begged me not to tell you anything, that he couldn't lose you too. But you knew it was a lie," I murmured from the bottom of my heart. "Yes, but he was my son, Henrietta, my only surviving son. How could I turn him over to the police? How could I destroy what was left of our family?" His justification hurt as much as my physical injuries. "And the stolen money?" I continued. Dennis promised me he would return it little by little. He swore it had been a bad decision, that he had been desperate, that it would never happen again. But he never returned a single penny. In fact, he kept stealing, and I kept quiet because every day that passed made me more of an accomplice to his crime. Just then we heard voices in the distance. Dennis and Sharon had managed to find help. Soon, rescue teams would be here, and our murderous children would play the roles of their lives, the traumatized survivors of a family tragedy. The voices got closer and closer, accompanied by the sound of helicopters flying over the area. The rescue team had arrived, and with them came the most crucial moment of our lives. Walter and I had to make a decision in a matter of minutes. Should we continue to pretend to be dead until we found the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth, or risk being rescued along with our murderers? Walter whispered urgently. The phone recorded everything that happened up there. We have Sharon's confession about the plan. We have Dennis admitting that we are obstacles. We have everything. But if they find us alive now, they can destroy the evidence before we manage to hand it over to the authorities. He was right. If Dennis and Sharon realized that we had survived and heard their confessions, they would find a way to silence us forever. This time it wouldn't be an accident. It would be something much more direct and final. We had to wait for the perfect moment. Their voices got louder. "They're down here," Dennis called from above. "My parents, please hurry." His performance was perfect, his voice broken with pain and despair. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed him. "Sir, stay calm," an authoritative voice replied, which must have belonged to the head of the rescue team. "We're going to come down to evaluate you. You and your wife can move." I heard the sound of ropes and equipment being prepared for the descent. Sharon had perfected her role as the grieving daughter-in-law. "I can't believe this happened," she sobbed. "We were taking pictures and it all happened so fast." Every word was a stab in my heart because I knew she would repeat those same lines to the police, to the media, to anyone who wanted to hear her version of events. The rescuers began to descend. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. I felt hands on my neck and somebody's ear close to my mouth, trying to detect breathing. "This one still has a faint pulse," one of them announced, referring to Walter. "The woman? I'm not sure. I need the medical team down here immediately." My heart raced. The plan was working. They would believe Walter was on the verge of death, while I would be close enough to death to not be an immediate threat. For the next few minutes, which felt like hours, the paramedics worked on us. I felt them put an oxygen mask on me, check my wounds and secure me to a stretcher. The whole time I had to fight every instinct to open my eyes, to ask for help, to stop pretending. "This man is stable but critical," one paramedic reported over the radio. "The woman is in very serious condition. Pulse is almost imperceptible. We need to transport them to the hospital immediately." Perfect. They would take us to the hospital where we would have the opportunity to talk to the authorities without Dennis and Sharon being able to silence us. During the ascent on the stretchers, I could hear Sharon's faint sobs and the words of comfort offered to her and Dennis by the rescuers. "You were so brave to survive this," someone told her. "It was a miracle we were alive," they said. If only they knew that the real miracle was that Walter and I were alive to tell the truth. At the emergency room, chaos swallowed us. Doctors and nurses shouted orders I could barely understand. They worked on my injuries. I had to keep pretending to be unconscious, while finding a way to communicate with someone I could trust. "Ma'am," I heard a nurse whisper. "Her vital signs are strange. Her pulse is stronger than we would expect for someone in her supposed condition." The doctor murmured. "It happens sometimes in cases of extreme trauma. The body clings to life in mysterious ways. We should keep a close watch." The next few hours were crucial. Sharon made a sound that was supposed to be a sob of pain, but to me it sounded like a sigh of relief. "Can we see them?" Dennis asked, his voice thin. "Just for a few minutes. We need to say goodbye just in case." The doctor agreed. Soon I felt footsteps approaching my bed. It was the most dangerous moment of all. I had to convince my murderous son I was really dying. Dennis stood by my side. His hand touched mine and it was all I could do not to pull away. "Mom," he whispered. "If you can hear me, I want you to know that I love you. I'm so sorry this happened." His words were poison honey, Sweet on the surface but deadly underneath. Sharon leaned in and murmured, "Henrietta dear, you've been like a mother to me. We'll never forget you." Liar. The only reason they wouldn't forget me was because they would have to live with the knowledge that they had murdered me. Then Dennis leaned closer to my ear and whispered something that chilled my blood. "I hope you've learned your lesson, Mom. You should never have asked so many questions about our finances. Some truths are better left buried, just like Ralph." At that moment I felt my plan begin to work. Dennis had just confessed, and even though I had no way to record it, there was a nurse in the room who had heard every word. The nurse hovered, eyes wide. Her name badge read Linda. She had frozen in place for a moment, and then she leaned in and whispered, "What did you say about Ralph?" Sharon muffled something under her breath. Dennis tensed, realizing he had said too much. "Nothing," he muttered. "I just meant, well, Mom always wondered what really happened that night. I guess it doesn't matter anymore." But it did matter. Everything mattered. Linda approached my bed. "Ma'am," she said so low I could barely hear her. "I know you can hear me. What I just heard is not normal. If you are in danger, you need to tell me somehow." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I moved my index finger. It was the smallest possible movement, but Linda noticed it immediately. "Oh my God," she whispered, and then she said, "She's pretending to be unconscious." I moved my finger again twice. "Yes, listen," she told me, leaning even closer. "I'm going to pretend I'm checking your monitors. If you are in danger from those people who were just here, move your finger 3 times. Without hesitation I moved my finger 3 times. Linda gasped. She moved away from my bed and pretended to check my 4 while she processed what she had just discovered. Her expression told me she understood the implications perfectly. Finally she came back close and said, "I'm going to talk to the doctor in charge, but I need you to keep pretending until we can protect you. Do you understand?" I moved my finger once more. The minutes that followed were agonizing. Linda left the room and I was left alone with the noise of the emergency ward and the distant sounds of Dennis and Sharon talking to other relatives and patients. My heart hammered so loud I was afraid someone else would hear it. I prayed Linda would act quickly. At last I heard footsteps approaching. Linda returned with an older man who must have been the chief doctor and 2 police officers. "Ma'am," the doctor said in a low voice, "Nurse Linda told me about your situation. If you can hear me, you are safe now. The officers are here to protect you." A wave of relief almost broke my act. "Can you open your eyes?" one of the officers asked. I opened them very slowly. The hospital lights blinded me, but I gradually focused on the worried faces around me. "Thank God," Linda murmured. "I thought I was losing my mind." The officer introduced himself. "I'm Detective Terrence Johnson. We understand you may be in a very dangerous situation. Can you tell us what really happened on that mountain?" My voice came out as a hoarse whisper after hours of pretending to be unconscious. My son and his wife pushed us. The whirlwind that followed was immediate. Statements, recordings, and revelations flooded the room. I told Detective Johnson everything I could remember about Ralph, the stolen money, the pressure to change the will, and most importantly about the recording on Walter's phone. "Your husband recorded evidence?" the detective asked, eyes sharpening. "Yes," I whispered. "Everything is on his phone. The plan, confessions, the talk about our money." Detective Johnson went to Walter right away. Walter had regained consciousness an hour after me. When the detective explained, Walter handed over his phone without hesitation and said, "Here's everything. 2 years of lies and the truth about what happened today." Police technicians began to analyze the recording. While they did, Dennis and Sharon remained in the waiting room acting as devastated family members. They did not know the recording would destroy their performance. When the detective returned, his face held a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. "The recording is clear," he said. "We have explicit confessions about Ralph's death, admissions about stealing money, and direct evidence of premeditated attempted murder against you. It's more than enough to arrest them." "Are you going to arrest them here?" I asked, still weak. "We already have officers in position," he replied. "Once we have the warrant signed, we will take them in. In the meantime, you are under police protection." The irony was cruel. Downstairs, our killers were probably consoling neighbors and planning funerals. Upstairs, in the hospital, We were exposing the rotten truth of their hearts. While the technicians examined Walter's phone, the detectives began a preliminary investigation into Dennis's finances. They discovered what Walter had suspected: bankruptcy, forged signatures, and debts to dangerous lenders. The picture that had been forming in our minds turned into a jagged proof. When the officers left to prepare the arrest, Detective Johnson sat by my bed and said gently, "We'll move fast. We'll get them out of the waiting room before they realize what's happening. You did the right thing by recording. It saved you both." I thought of all the nights of silence, of the choice Walter had made to keep the secret, and of the price we had paid for his mercy. The rescue, the hospital, and that single nurse named Linda had become our lifeline. We had survived the fall and, by a fragile thread, caught the moment when truth met justice. Detective Terrence Johnson returned an hour later, holding a folder of papers. His expression was firm but heavy. "It's time," he said. "The warrants are signed. We're going to arrest them now." Through the window of my hospital room, I could see several police officers positioning themselves discreetly in the parking lot below. My heart pounded. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not just since the fall, but for 25 years. I heard the voice of the arresting officer over the hospital intercom. "Dennis Ballantyne and Sharon Ballantyne, you are under arrest for the murder of Ralph Ballantyne and the attempted murder of Henrietta and Walter Ballantyne." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came Sharon's shrill, hysterical voice echoing down the corridor. "What are you talking about? We're the victims here. Our parents died in an accident." "Ma'am," one of the officers said calmly, "your in-laws are alive and have provided complete evidence of your crimes." There was a pause. Then Dennis shouted, his voice cracking, "That's impossible. We saw them die. They were dead." That single outburst, "We saw them die," was recorded on the officers' body cameras. Another piece of evidence confirming what they had done. Moments later I heard more shouting. Sharon began to blame Dennis. "It was all his idea. I didn't want to do any of this. He forced me." And Dennis, panicking, yelled, "You were the one who suggested the cliff. You planned all of it." Their alliance, built on lies, greed, and murder, collapsed in seconds. Detective Johnson came back to my room with a slow nod. "They're both in custody. They're trying to turn on each other. That only makes our case stronger." But then he added something that made my blood run cold. "During the arrest, we found this in your son's backpack." He pulled out a small digital recorder. "He had been recording conversations with you and your husband for the last few weeks, probably trying to catch any sign that you suspected him." "What does that mean?" I asked, my throat tightening. "It means he knew you were starting to figure things out. The trip wasn't spontaneous. It was premeditated." In one of the recordings you can clearly hear Sharon telling him, "We have to act fast before they go to the police." The depth of their planning stole my breath. They hadn't just plotted to kill us. They had monitored our every word, calculated every step. We were rats in their maze and they thought they were the scientists. The detective continued, "Your son forged your signatures on several documents. He had already arranged access to your bank accounts. If you had died on that mountain, he would have gained control of everything within hours." I closed my eyes, feeling both fury and sorrow wash through me. "How much money did he take?" "About $50,000 over the past 5 years, Detective Johnson said. "Small amounts but consistent. The total adds up. Every penny came from decades of work, from the sacrifices we made to build our family's life. And my own son had drained it away while smiling in my face." Over the next few days, the hospital became a revolving door of detectives, lawyers, and reporters. The local news called it the most horrifying family betrayal of the decade. Reporters wanted interviews, photographs, statements. I couldn't speak to them. Not yet. My sister Bernice came to see me, tears streaming down her face. She held my hand as if afraid I might vanish. "I always knew something was off about Dennis after Ralph died," she whispered. "But I never imagined this. Lord, Henrietta, how did you survive that fall?" I smiled weakly. "Because Walter whispered, 'Pretend we're dead.'" Her tears turned into quiet sobs. "We talked about the grandchildren, innocent, confused, asking why their parents couldn't come home. 'They're with social services for now,' Bernice said. 'But the detective said you can apply for custody once you recover.' The thought of raising the children of the people who had tried to kill me felt unbearable at first. But then I realized it was the only way to break the cycle. They deserved love that wasn't twisted by greed or deceit. When Lawrence, our lawyer, visited, he confirmed what Detective Johnson had already said. The case is solid, he told us. Between the recording, their confessions, and the financial evidence, there's no way they can escape serious convictions. But their lawyers are already trying to reduce the charges. They're calling it a crime of passion brought on by financial stress. I sat up in my hospital bed, my voice shaking with anger. A crime of passion? They planned this for weeks. They bought equipment, forged signatures, lied to our faces, and chose the perfect place to make our deaths look accidental. That's not passion. That's evil. Lawrence nodded. And that's exactly what you'll tell the court. Your testimony will be powerful, but it won't be easy. You'll have to look them in the eyes. I'll do it, I said. For Ralph. For Walter. For our grandchildren. 3 weeks later, Walter and I finally went home. We moved slowly, still covered in bruises and bandages. The house felt like a ghost of itself. The breakfast dishes were still in the sink. The flowers Dennis had brought the week before the trip sat shriveled in a vase on the table. Everything was frozen in time, the moment before our lives ended and began again. That night, lying in our old bed, I whispered, "Do you think we'll ever be happy again?" Walter turned to me, his voice soft but firm. "I don't know, Henrietta. But we're alive. And for the first time in 25 years, we don't have to live with secrets." We fell asleep holding hands the way we did when we were young, two broken people who had somehow survived the storm. 6 months later, the trial began. When I took the stand, I looked Dennis in the eye. There was no remorse, no regret, only a hollow anger that mirrored his father's eyes from long ago. I told the court everything, from the night Ralph died to the moment Walter grabbed his killer's arm at the cliff. When I finished, I turned to Dennis and said, "I don't know who you are anymore, but you are no longer my son. My son died the night you killed Ralph. What's been living in his place is a monster that I helped create because I was too blind to see." The courtroom was silent. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict came back. Guilty on all counts. Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder for Ralph's death and first-degree attempted murder for trying to kill us. Sharon was convicted as an accomplice. Both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. A year later, Walter and I adopted our grandchildren. They are the light that pulled us back from the darkness. Every night, I tuck them into bed and tell them stories about their Uncle Ralph, about his kindness, his honesty, and his dreams. We do not speak of their parents' crimes, not yet. One day when they are old enough, I'll tell them the truth, not to haunt them but to teach them. Because love without truth becomes poison. And secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always climb their way back to the surface. It's been a year since the trial ended. Some days it still feels like I'm standing on that cliff, wind in my face, the edge of death beneath my feet. Other days it feels like a dream, a terrible story that happened to someone else. But then I look at my grandchildren and I remember, it was all real. Every morning, I wake up before sunrise and sit on the porch with Walter. The mountain air is cool, and the world feels quiet again. He still walks with a limp from the fall, and my right arm never fully healed. But we're alive. We made it out. Sometimes we talk about Ralph. Sometimes we don't. His photo sits on the mantel, next to 2 small faces who remind me that life, no matter how broken, can begin again. The world knows our story now. The news outlets called it the cliffside betrayal, and strangers from across the country sent letters, some offering comfort, others confessing that they, too, live in fear of the people they love most. One woman wrote, "Your story saved my life. I finally left my abusive son before it was too late." It hurts to be remembered for tragedy, but if our survival can open someone's eyes, then maybe it wasn't all in vain. When Walter and I first visited Dennis and Sharon in prison, it wasn't to forgive them. It was to face them. Dennis looked smaller, older. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something hollow. He couldn't meet my eyes. Sharon just stared at the floor. I didn't speak in anger. I said, "You tried to bury us, but all you did was uncover the truth. You thought death would end your lies. Instead, it exposed them." Dennis cried then, silent, bitter tears that didn't move me. "I'm sorry, Mama." he whispered, but his words sounded rehearsed like every other lie he'd told. I left him there with his guilt where he belonged. When we got home, I went to the backyard, the place where Walter once built our sons a treehouse. The wood is worn now, the paint chipped, but I still hear their laughter echoing through the trees. I sat beneath that tree and whispered to the wind, "It's over now, Ralph. You can rest." That night, I dreamed of both my sons. Ralph stood in the sunlight, smiling the way he used to when he came home from college, arms full of books and hope. Dennis stood in the shadows, silent, watching. When I woke up, I realized the dream wasn't about forgiveness. It was about acceptance. Evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it's born inside the walls we build to keep us safe. But love, the kind that endures storms, secrets, and betrayal, is the thing that saves us. Walter and I learned that too late, but not too late to pass it on. Now, every night before bed, I tell my grandchildren stories about Ralph, his kindness, his laughter, his courage. I want them to know what true strength looks like. And when they ask about their parents, I tell them only this: some people lose their way in darkness, but you, my loves, were born from survivors. Never forget that truth will always find the light. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the kids are asleep, Walter takes my hand and whispers, "We made it, Henrietta." And I whisper back, "Yes, we did. We finally made it home." Then I close my eyes and listen, to the laughter in the next room, to the wind in the trees, to the heartbeat of a life that refused to die. Because after all the lies, the pain, and the years of silence, there's one thing I know for sure. Love didn't save us from the fall. It saved us after it.